In yet another wave of unrest, clashes broke out in Sweden's city of Malmo following the latest Quran burning incident. It all began after an anti-Islamic protestor burned a copy of the holy book, which led to counter-protests that tried to stop him, leaving many injured and detained in the process. It was the latest in a string of burnings that have hit the Nordic country this year, where a recent poll found that more than half of Swedes want a ban on the burning of religious texts. Nili Kossad has more.
Sweden's latest Quran burning incident has again descended into chaos and violence. Protesters trying to stop the Muslim holy book from being burned clashed with police in the southern Swedish city of Malmo. Scandinavia has witnessed a series of Quran burnings that have tested the country's tolerance for free speech. This past year alone, far-right groups in Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands have all staged Quran burning events and rallies. The most recent one was by an Iraqi refugee in Sweden, which put Stockholm into a diplomatic corner, forcing it to clarify where it stands.
Let me be clear. Islamophobic acts in any form are rejected by the Swedish government in the strongest terms. They do not reflect the government's opinions.
The trend of Quran burnings in Europe date back centuries, but has re-emerged in the past several years. And this has much to do with Danish-Swedish politician Rasmus Paludan. In January, and under the guise of free speech, he burned a copy of Islam's holy book outside the Turkish embassy in Stockholm, as Ankara was mulling Sweden's bid to join NATO. Both Sweden and neighboring Denmark suggest that freedom of speech is a key pillar of their democracies and have stepped back from taking any firm action.
In the Danish People's Party, we are firmly against limiting the freedom of expression. It's a cornerstone in any vibrant modern democracy.
However, critics suggest that such blatant Islamophobic acts cannot be swept under the rug in the name of freedom of expression. And a number of leaders, including Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, have condemned what he called a hate crime. But it didn't stop there. Paludan continued his stunts outside Sweden's parliament, as well as in Copenhagen, to incite others to do the same. For months, far-right followers burned and desecrated the holy book opposite mosques and embassies of Muslim-majority nations all throughout Europe. And from Iraq to Indonesia to Kashmir and Afghanistan, these actions sparked major protests across the Muslim world.
Our holy book, the Quran, has been insulted in Sweden. We call on the international community to hand over the Quran burner to the International Court and punish them.
But it seems Quran burnings are just the tip of the iceberg. Anti-Muslim hate speech and Islamophobia are on the rise in much of Europe. France has recently added to its long-standing ban on headscarves in public schools by also outlawing the abaya. The European Islamophobia report details how Muslims are experiencing increased cases of institutionalized discrimination through both legislation and government policies. Many protesters in Malmo have already reached the edge, and fears are growing that the tide of Islamophobia across Europe could fuel more unrest. Nili Kossad, TRT World.
And to further discuss the latest Quran burnings, joining me now from Paris is Yasser Louati. He is the head of the Committee for Justice and Liberties for All. And from Ankara, Klaus Jurgens, he is a political analyst. A warm welcome to you both, and thanks for joining me on Straight Talk. So, Yasser, after the latest Quran burning incident, Sweden has arrested more than a dozen people for trying to block the burning of the holy book. Why have these incidents flared up recently again?
Well, because first, Sweden did not show any discontent with these Quran burnings for years. It's almost encouraged them in the name of freedom of speech, discounting the fact that it's not freedom of speech when you attack people who can't answer you. But now, what Sweden is, facing is consequences on the international scene, and Sweden having to answer for this legitimization of, burning down Qurans. And now, of course, people can say people have the right to do it. So be it, but we give people liberties when they are responsible. And these liberties, when it comes to freedom of speech, come responsibility. And so far, the Swedish government has been acting irresponsibly, and now is paying the cost for it. Is paying the cost for it when it comes, for example, to its NATO adhesion or its stature on the international scene.
So, Klaus, the protests in Malmo erupted after Salvan Momika, an Iraqi refugee living in Stockholm, burned a copy of the Quran for the second time. He seems quite persistent in his acts, actually. So what does this tell us about the Swedish authorities' approach towards these so-called protests when they are clearly meant to be provocative rather than exercising free speech?
Actually, I think the Swedish government should follow the Danish government, and even the Danish government is not as of yet where it actually should be. But the plan to say someone can be arrested for 2 years after such a similar incident is already a step into the right direction. Now back to Sweden. I think Sweden urgently has to come to terms with the fact, do we redefine freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and where do we draw the line between provocative or even criminal and illegal acts? And my esteemed guest here before me said exactly rightly, so far the Swedish government has not come of age, and it is high time. Now, Ulf Kristersson said himself, we have to raise the terror level. Now, this is the interesting point I wanted to reiterate. Apparently, the Swedish government now thinks about terror threats on its own soil because of its own reputation being tarnished by not being more outspoken against the burning of the Quran or similar acts. It is sad that such a development has to occur. It should have never happened. But now let's be 1% optimistic. Let's see the Swedish government now, when everyone is back from holidays, will they come to the realization that it is not just burning of a holy book, it is not just the Quran burning, it is literally tarnishing Sweden's reputation, and not only in the Muslim world, basically everywhere. People ask the question, how come you want to be a role model democracy? You criticize other countries, you must lead the way. So yes, high time.
So, Yasser, following last month's incidents over these Quran burnings, Sweden's Prime Minister Kristersson said the security situation in the country is at its most serious level since World War II. And now he called the events in Malmo terrible. So has the situation deteriorated, and how are anti-Islam protests impacting, as Klaus mentioned, the country's security as well as its reputation?
Well, first, one has to highlight how Muslim communities in their overwhelming majority have been exemplary in dealing with that. They took their own freedom of speech, they rallied against it, and they reminded the government that their freedom, this is not freedom of speech, this is freedom to provoke people, because should Muslims start burning the Swedish flag or start burning whatever is held sacred for the majority of Swedish people, be they Christians or not, we would see, of course, a national uproar. And as a matter of fact, Western countries have passed laws to prohibit the burning or the mocking of national symbols. I can speak of my country, France. We banned, the mocking of the French flag. You can get fined, even go to jail for it. People are getting arrested. Even, stand-up comedians are being arrested for mocking Emmanuel Macron. So Sweden has recognized that everyone is entitled to have something sacred, and living together means that, yes, I have the freedom to mock people, but I will not do it out of responsibility towards myself and my neighbor, but also towards my own nation. As for the security situation, I wouldn't blow things out of proportion like the Swedish minister did, but I do raise the alarm on how far the far right has come to clinching in power in Sweden. They had a 20% score in the 2018 elections, a party that says, quote unquote, Muslims are not fully human. And I think the Swedish government should deal with that first.
So, Klaus, the question is, how is Sweden going to find a balance between freedom of speech and the incitement of hatred? Because we know since these incidents took place, Swedish police is said to have received more applications asking for permission to burn their religious texts. And on the other hand, there is this poll that says half of Swedes want a ban on the burning of religious texts. So is there a deadlock here?
Well, it's a very good point, Aish. Now, as you may know, I came back from Sweden and will be returning very very shortly for a number of meetings. Now, the general climate in Sweden, pardon me if I say it so bluntly, is neither anti-Turkey, anti-Muslim, anti-multiculturalism, anti-anything. It is a minority that tries to create havoc. But the real danger is that this minority actually might play into the hands, as my colleague just mentioned, of the far-right populists who are silently, discreetly winning and gaining at the ballot box, sometimes with an open anti-multiculturalism, anti-Muslim agenda, sometimes much more discreet. Austria, a good example, joining the anti-corona vaccination bandwagon and camouflaging its anti-internationalism, anti-Muslim attitude. Now, Sweden has to come to terms with something else.
Yes.
It was a rather peaceful, quiet democracy country. And then all of a sudden, geopolitically and world dynamics changed. Then the NATO situation arose. And now it has to redefine where do we stand? What is our democracy? And I could go on for this, but as we said, 2 minutes maximum.
Okay, so Yasser, the last question. The Organization of the Islamic Cooperation last month called on its member states to take appropriate political and economic measures against Sweden and other countries that allow the burning of the holy book. What have they done so far except for condemning?
I am not the type to be politically correct, so I will say it bluntly, nothing that could be noticeable on the grounds. We hear the OIC or the IOC, depending on the language, speak of Islamophobia and blasphemy, etc., but they are nowhere to be found to support Western Muslims' struggle against Islamophobia. We see their governments cozying up to the most brutal far-right governments around the Western world. They have no problem working with any far-right government, should it be in Europe or elsewhere. So now it's about this organization to come to terms with its absence when it comes to Islamophobia. And fighting Islamophobia is not only about speeches at the UN, it's also standing with grassroots organizations and helping them get the means to properly counter the narrative that is prevalent in countries like France, Germany, Sweden, Austria, etc., where Muslims are constantly painted in a dark spot and portrayed either as a terrorist threat or in a national identity threat or economic threat. They are here to take our jobs.
All right, gentlemen, we are out of time. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.